Just
My name is Michael Allen. For some of you that know me, this may be the last time you see me speak to you, and for some of you that may not know me, this will obviously be perhaps the first time and the last time. Before I start off, I would just like to say that before the camera guy got here, I was laying down and sleeping. For the first time in a long time, I had a crying dream where I woke up crying, and that was actually pretty frequent after my son died years ago, and then it became less and less frequent. It occurred less frequently, but and I was kind of wondering why, and I don't remember that the dream was especially a bad dream. I don't remember, but a few hours ago, somebody that I'd known, and I guess I'd put this under the topic of life's little disappointments, but somebody that I know who told me yesterday that they were coming by and we were going to have lunch, and I was going to get a chance to see them again. Well, I called them after the time that we'd agreed upon, and obviously what I didn't realize is that when we had spoken that they had been drunk, and they didn't remember at all. And I guess it was that disappointment that made me wake up the way I did, but I've lived long enough to know that life is full of little and some not so little disappointments, and I was almost surprised at how I felt about it. I mean, I've had a couple of major disappointments in my life in the last 10 so years, and that just kind of amuses me. But it also lets me know that there's a part of me that's still, very, very human and very tender. Maybe I'm more tender with what's going on, and a lot of you know what's going on is that a few weeks ago, doctors examined me and they told me basically to put my life in order. Put my affairs in order, they said. In other words, they gave me a diagnosis of pending death. And I guess that's what I'd like to talk about first, is the surprise. The surprise of death. And I don't mean like, you're riding along, all of a sudden there's a 18-wheeler truck in front of you in the wrong lane, they're getting ready to run over you and kill you, and it's a momentary surprise, and boom, you're gone. I mean, the surprise of, in my case, the surprise of, as it unfolds, and the changes that I imagine most people go through. I can only speak for myself, and I've been pretty cavalier about it. As a lot of you know, I buried a child I raised as a single parent a few years ago, and this cavalier attitude, I think, comes from the fact that for so many years I felt like a part of me was dead, and then I buried that part of my emotional being and my heart with him. And I have had a cavalier attitude, but there's surprising things about it. I'm continuously surprised by the things I experience in life, and this is one thing that I haven't necessarily experienced. So, like I said, I'm continually surprised at the places my mind goes, and the doubts and the fears and the uncertainties, and the good stuff too that comes along with it. it amazes me. But I realize, and this is stuff that I've realized for a long time, that a lot of the, to me, the substance and the reason and the almost sole purpose of religion is to kind of allay those fears that I think we all carry around about death, about the other side. And I think that it's pretty much bullshit, because nobody really knows. I think that there's no cell phones over there. There's no postal service. People don't, people say, they came back and it was a brilliant light or it was beautiful, but I think that they weren't really fully invested in their own death. And I do know enough about the mind and how the mind works to realize that our minds are a function of our brains. And our brains are basically physiological organs. In other words, thoughts are little pulses of energy running through neural pathways in our brain. And that is the physical aspect, but the psychological aspect is something we call our minds. But neither of them can exist without the brain doing its things. And when our body ceases to function, neural activity ceases to function, and we don't have that stuff, and we don't even have a sense of self anymore. It's simply impossible. I believe that there's a spiritual energy that resides in us all somewhere, that goes somewhere, but I don't know where, and I don't know that there's any facilities within that energy to consciously report it or even be aware of it. I think it's just something that is, and it's not as though there's even a past or present or future to it. It's just as the moment, as the second, as a microsecond unfolds, we're within life in a way that we as human beings can't imagine, because we always imagine that there's this past part of it and there's this future part of it, and I'm not sure that's real. I think it's something that we've constructed in our minds. And at one point I started thinking about this phrase I hear a lot of people use about the other side. And I was wondering about that, and I thought about Martin Buber, and his big thing was self and other. And his theory was that, his great metaphor was, I see the tree and the tree sees me. So what Buber was saying basically was that when I see any object outside of myself, I move towards it in a corresponding way that it moves towards me. And the interchange and the perception actually happens somewhere in the middle of us, and Buber implied that we're aware of each other. That's probably hard to understand, and so I put it another way. Hegel, his thing he was famous for was something called the rationale with an E. The rationale is the real. And what Hegel said was, when we see something outside of ourselves, we bring it in and we decide in our mind what it is. So it actually exists for us in our mind and not outside of ourselves. So he's saying that there's something between what's that tree I see and me deciding it's a tree. There's a third thing going on. It's not just me rationalizing what I see, these two things going on. There's a third thing, which is the rationale itself, which tells me that there's a tree outside of me. So I think what I'm trying to say is that as I move closer to my death, I realize that there is a connection. I believe that there is a connection between us and all things. And when we're released from this body, that the connection becomes more clear and we become less aware of ego and self. And you know, these things don't, to me, and I'm just spitballing here, you guys, you can change the channel if you want, but I think that these mental tools we create for ourselves and that we teach each other and that we share, called logic and reason, I don't believe they exist beyond ourselves. I believe they're human constructs of the mind, and that they only exist in the mind. And as I said, they only exist as a function of neurological patterns and the firing of neurons and energy. And when we die, that all of that ceases to function, and that reason and logic becomes something that lives only in the realm of the living, those with brains. So in some ways I wish I could be more aware, because I'm really curious how that occurs when we pass over to the other side. You know, I believe that, like I said, I believe that heaven or hell doesn't exist. I believe it's something we've made up to feel better and to moralize and to teach our kids and even our older adult people a reason to be I don't like to use the word moral, to define moral, but it teaches us to behave in a way that is more conducive to the peaceful interchange and transfer of things in life. And I say transfer of things, and I'm definitely thinking about property. A lot of people don't realize that we live in an agrarian society and a culture that has to do with when mankind started planting fields of crops instead of just finding them or planting them in mounds in the woods, which primitive societies still do. You can see it. You can see the practice all over the Amazon with these tribes that have had no contact with human beings, and they're basically hunter-gatherers. When we made that transition, we moved to a place where people claimed land and claimed ownership of different things. And one of the first places that happened was a place called the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. Remarkably, that's one of the most well-known areas to where, at least in Western culture, was the development of religion. This codified set of beliefs on what is moral and immoral behavior, and consequently deriving out of it the ethos that gave us laws. The law of Hammurabi was one of the earliest examples of this in the same Tigris-Euphrates Valley area. So it got me to thinking that, well, maybe all of that supports each other, and that's what I do believe. I believe that religion, besides being a moral construct and something to allay our fears, also supports and reinforces this idea of private ownership. And in that respect, I believe that it is as destructive a force on earth as there's ever been. And the fact that so many millions and millions of people have been killed in the name of God would sort of back up my my assumption there. So I take no comfort in any kind of established religion, and hear that I'm on the threshold of death, and it doesn't bother me, because I feel that I understand it. I feel these patterns of energy in our lives that are somehow running through our lives, whether we realize it or not. You know, and just like a couple of cell phones aren't attached. If I punch in your phone number, your phone will ring. There's no wires, but there's patterns of energy running all around us that they transmit on. Even though we can't see it, does not mean they don't exist. And that's why I believe the intangible a lot of times is more real than what we say to ourselves. as tangible reality. So, but still, life's a surprise. It's a lot different than death. I presume, like I said, even while you're watching this, I may know, but I don't believe that I'll be able to tell you. And I do believe, like Mark said, that religion is an opiate because people are afraid, and they would indulge in all kinds of bad behavior if not for the moral guidelines set down by men. And I've said for a long time that I don't believe that man was made in the image of God. I believe that God was created in the image of man, by man. It's a funny story. A very religious, Christian kind of guy, religious friend of mine, used to have these arguments with me and try to convince me of the truth of the Bible. And he would say, the Bible is the Word. So finally one day I said, where did the Word has always existed. I got him to agree with that. I said, before it was written down, where did the Word exist? And he didn't know what to say, and I already knew the answer. I said, it exists, the Word of God. In other words, the way we're supposed to treat each other existed in the heart of every man before it was ever written down or even spoke about or given a word. And he didn't have any other choice but to agree with me, because it's true. It's absolutely true. And I'll be the first one to admit that there is a relative nature to truth, but I don't believe this is a relative thing. Even as William James said in Variety of Religious Experience, he said that no matter if you're the Pope in the Vatican or you're a little brown guy sitting under a bush in the furthest reaches of the Amazon, we all have this fundamental understanding of a spiritual essence. And I believe that's true. I believe William James was onto something there. And in that respect, I don't logically understand it, but I've reached the point where I don't, and I can't explain, I don't have to. I have a feeling that God is, and there needs to be no words attached to it, because I realize that words are actually just the faulty construct of our minds trying to objectify themselves, trying to make meaning of ourselves. And I have no problem with not understanding. For the first time in my life, well, not the first time, it's been coming for about 8 or 10 years, I understand that I will not understand. And it brings to mind something Socrates said. Somebody said, well, tell us something that you know is absolutely true. And he said, the only thing that I know is absolutely true is there is nothing that I know that is absolutely true. And so this comfort in not knowing, and I wouldn't call it ignorance, but it may be, it's real. And I believe that we become more smart within ourselves and objective and of value to the world when we admit that we don't know. But I wanted to mention that about how I see things and how I understand things, and I don't understand things. And another good book that discusses that is by a guy named Alan Watts, and it's called The Wisdom of Insecurity. Short book, easy to read. If you can find it, read it, and you'll understand what I'm trying to say. But there's a few things I like to talk about before I go. And as a matter of fact, when the production team got here, I was watching a video that had to deal with this, and that's identity politics. Because right now I'm thinking, I'm on my way out. There's a lot of work that I just haven't got to. I've been trying to build coalitions and take on who I thought was a bad guy, who I thought I could affect, and I've been trying to put people in the streets to fight together against a common enemy, which is usually ignorance driven by capitalism. And the idea that, according to the Bible even, and deriving out of this Tigris-Euphrates Valley thing, is that some people have the right to have more than other people. And I simply don't believe that. That's something that offends me. But one of the tools that we're taught by the people who have the power in this country is to think in terms of the people who look like us, people who act like us, the people who talk like us, and to create obstacles to being able to be to fully invest ourselves with people who don't look like us or talk like us or act like us, so that we all stay in our own little corners as we fight against the injustice that coincidentally is visited on every community. And I know it's popular these days for smaller marginalized communities to say, well, it's white people. White people are the reason, and they have white privilege. And I reject that. I'm 93% white. You know, Ancestry.com tells me 7% of my bloodline comes from Africa, which leads to an important question to me. If reparations are paid, do I get paid 7%? I mean, I'm willing to accept it. But I think that whole idea is erroneous and wrong, because number one, white people didn't invent slavery. It's not a phenomena that's only occurred in the last 400 years. It's always been a part of the human experience. The Greeks owned white slaves, the Chinese owned Chinese slaves, and on and on. I believe there were indigenous slaves, captives taken from other tribal fights, and even settlers. You know, there's plenty of settlers that were taken as children and kept by the Indians. But of course, the indigenous culture is such an amazing culture that a large part of them decided, you know, even when given the opportunity to be free, that they chose to stay with the indigenous people and the tribal members they were with, because the way of life was so much more responsive to the needs of human beings. You know, and I read something that tickled me, because they pointed out that indigenous cultures, Indian cultures that we're talking about in America, were easily as social and as civil as the white cultures, more so. But the difference was there were no policemen in Indian cultures. They had different ways of enforcing the morals and the mores, you know, whether it's banishment or just everybody staring at you and telling you bad and shaking your finger, or some variation like that. But it worked with them. So getting back to what I was saying, the mainstream culture, and to me the mainstream culture isn't white people so much as it's moneyed people. And the way they keep people from getting their fair share is to keep them divided and believing within themselves that the true enemy is not the rich, but the other marginalized communities. It's the brown people trying to come in this country and take your money. It's the black people trying to get affirmative action and get through college easier than you that are going to take your job. It's the immigrants from India that are going to take your job. It goes on and on. They focus. They offer us this reasoning, this logic, to see it that way. And then they do something else that, I mean, I heard the term, and I can't tell you where I heard the term, but there's something called psychological apparatus. And what that means is, not only are we taught what to think, we're taught how to think. The best example I could give, or examples, is the U.S. military, who they teach you this way of thinking that makes you believe that it's all right to take another human life. And another example would be outlaw biker gangs. that make you believe that it's all right to hurt people, and just, hang with your own group, and everybody outside of the group is somehow less than human. In other words, it encourages a divisiveness between, as Buber said, self and the other. And they teach us this as small children. This is your family, everybody else is someone else. This is your town, everybody else is someone else. This is your country. Everyone else is someone else and not as fully invested in the rights as you are. And we believe that lie. And we carry on that lie. And we teach our children that lie. And it is a lie, but what's so frightening to me about it is a manner of thinking that we get taught that we never identify as being such. And so life goes on. We end up in our little corners trying to fight the system. We never can. The system is designed to fight us in small numbers. If we were ever to put 3% of the population, studies have been done, 3% of the population in the streets, that has never occurred without wholesale regime change in any country ever that it's occurred in. And this is ever. But it becomes incumbent upon the really rich to keep those kind of numbers from occurring. And this isn't a new problem. The colonialists, the rich colonialists, this country was started by rich men, rich white men. And at one point they were concerned because Indians and indentured servants and slaves were finding a way of working together to oppose them. So they did several things to keep that from developing. And one of the things they did was they killed the hell out of the Indians, drove them out, destroyed their villages, killed their women and children, and decimated their numbers. With chattel slavery, they became much more harsh in their punishment of the slaves. And with indentured servants, they gave them jobs as overseers and as supervisors to the chattel slaves, and drove a wedge in between them to where these indentured servants believed that it was in their best interest to to intimidate these black slaves. So this happened, in the 1600s. And it goes on today. They're still using one form or another of it to keep us from fighting together. And that's the problem with identity politics. When we believe that we're so different from anyone else, that our needs will only be met and our political ends can only be achieved by fighting with each other and leaving these obstacles and these barriers up between other poor people, be they white or black or brown or red. As long as we stay separate, the bad guys, the rich guys win. I don't know how many of you know it, but at the time of the American Revolution, the wealthiest man in the United States, you may have heard of him. His name was George Washington. He had more wealth than any other man in America at that time. Another funny thing, they call him the father of our country. He never had any kids. But this identity politics, that is a real problem for us. Another thing is this, that derives out of it actually, is a security culture. We believe we must protect ourselves and be less than forthright with anybody that is not on the inside of the circle. And it's not just, it doesn't break along racial lines. A good friend of mine tried to attend a Black Lives Matter meeting the other night. And she said they were polite to her, but at some point they told her, well, this is a closed meeting and you're not invited. Well, she's a black woman. And yet this group that's supposedly fighting for black rights excluded her. So even with its own ranks, within its own ranks, it excluded her. And I don't believe that that's exclusive behavior for any groups trying to fight the system. Some people matter more than other people. It's part of this psychological apparatus that they teach us, these rich white people teach us. And we use the same weapons that they use against us. We try to use it against them in our little groups. But the reality is that when hate fights hate, hate always wins. And our system is backed up by hate, by non-love for other people, non-identification, non-compassion, non-empathy. It cannot reach beyond a certain point because it is based on disassociation and disconnection, which can only come through some kind of form of, to me, hate. So, I've been fighting to change the world for a few years, and it took me years to realize who the enemy really was. I mean, the ones that I would meet most often face to face. It wasn't the white supremacists. It wasn't the rich bankers. It wasn't the rednecks. It was the people like me in these activist organizations who claim to be awake or woke, who are using the same tactics against the people who oppress them as the people who oppress them were using against them. This lack of understanding, this lack of connection, this superior belief in self to the exclusion of the inferior other. And that is a problem that I confronted and I faced every day with y'all. I'm not saying all of you, but this is a predominant way of thinking that we have. And the way I look at it is many, many, many of us, I'm not sure I've always been different, but many, and sometimes I probably fall into that, but we want to get the man's foot off our throat so we can put our foot on someone else's. And as long as that's what we think, nothing can change. We become unwitting reactionaries and supporters of the system as it exists. When I hate the police, I'm doing exactly what they want, because my hatred fuels the system and makes it stronger where it is. And yet I don't think a lot of us think that. We think in an adversarial way that says we've got to fight them and beat them senseless to take this away from them. I don't believe that's true. I believe all we're doing then is replacing one set of son of a bitches with another set of son of a bitches who, by the way, sort of look like us. It's very difficult for me to understand the paradigm of power, the thoughts surrounding power in terms of, if you hit me, I don't hit you back. I didn't understand, and a lot of me still probably doesn't understand, how can that be power? And then slowly, gradually, over the last several years, I've come to understand that when you come to me with your hate, and I bring it into me, and I think about it, and then I direct back to you an energy that says, I understand, and it's all right, and I don't give you your hate back. I have ascended to a position of power because I no longer react. My behavior is proactive. But it's a very difficult thing to do because we've been raised to believe that there is us and there is them. And this idea permeates all parts of our culture, and especially the left. We're no different than they are. We wear different clothes, we scream different things, but we're all screaming I remember several years ago at the Islamic Center downtown Houston, there were some Nazis, and I assume they were Nazis. They were flying Nazi flags, and they were carrying, you know, AK-47s. You know how those guys do. And they were on one side of the street screaming, bullhorns and everything, at the people on the other side of the street that were, and I was with them, and we were supporting Muslims and their right to be accorded the rights as free Americans. And I noticed something. I looked behind me, and the people behind me, they were screaming and saying very incendiary things, directing these comments and this screaming across the street to these Nazis. And I realized that I was trapped between two groups of people that were using the same weapons to fight each other. And I thought, no one can win in this. Because the system which is based on this hatred of each other, and especially each, if you look different than me, other, was alive and well. This could never change anything. And, you know, that I could mark the day when I started to understand who the real enemy to changing the world is. And I don't know if it's an equal part, but it's not them, y'all. They don't carry the weight of the majority burden of weight. We share it, and I think equally, as long as no one understands that nothing can change. And so I know I've been to meetings where I have been called down by, when I fight police brutality, I've been called down by young black people who say, "What can you know, you old white man? This affects us." And I don't disagree, but I disagree that it only affects black people or brown people or poor white people. I believe it affects everyone. This atmosphere, this culture of police violence, and that it's somehow okay. It affects everyone, because I forget who said it in World War II. You know, they came for these people and we did nothing, and they came for these and we did nothing, and then they came for us. That's what's going to happen, because it's all about power and wealth in this country. And as time goes on, once they get the money out of us, and we're basically economic slaves, which many of us are already, they're going to start preying on each other. And in the end, there's just going to be a few people at the very top, and everybody else is going to be at the very bottom. And I don't think people realize that. You know, I get the impression sometimes that a lot of oppressed minorities think that this economic pressure that they feel, this poverty they experience in their cultures, is something that is exclusive to them. But I know from the numbers that there's something less than 9 million Hispanic people in this country that live under the poverty level, and almost an equal number of black people, 10 million, that live under the poverty level in this country. But what I don't think that a lot of people realize is that the number for whites, poor whites in this country, that live under the poverty level is around 22 million. There are more poor white people in this country than poor brown and poor black people combined. And I wonder sometimes when some of these marginalized communities believe they know who the enemy is, if they include these poor white people too. And it breaks my heart, because all of these 40, however many million people have more in common with each other than the poor whites do with probably even the middle class and upper class whites, and certainly they have less in common with the filthy rich whites. I don't know how to encourage you guys to break out of it. I would ask that you read Huey Newton and Bobby Seals and the old Black Panthers. They were not a nationalist organization. They were a Marxist organization. They invited everyone to take part. In fact, their slogan was, all power to all people. The government knew how destructive that was, and they, COINTELPRO, they destroyed the Black Panthers as an organization. They filled them full of infiltrators that created situations that gave them the excuse to go in there and just shoot them up and kill them. Fred Hampton, they killed him. They killed it because they were trying to keep the system alive and well so that rich people have the right to make more and more money by reaching further and further into each and every one of our pockets. And that's what's going on even today. Unless we figure out a way of working together and allowing our leaders to emerge and not demand that they look like us in order to follow them, we don't have a chance. We just don't have a chance. They have the firepower. They have the cops. They have the border patrol. They have the guns to outgun us. But when we all stand together, they don't. And that's an important point. We have to learn to diminish the differences and increase our understanding of the similarities between all of us. And I don't see that happening. I hear voices out in the wilderness saying the same thing about this destructive identity politics, and a little bit less about the security culture that these groups embark on and incorporate to keep other people from coming in. I don't know how to change. Susan B. Anthony said, agitate. No, she said, educate, agitate, organize. This is our battle cry. And this is what I tell people, and this is what I do. I try to educate people through my posts. I mean, I've kind of withdrawn from organizing, and I was as good, if not a better organizer than most people in this city of Houston for the last 10 years. This is according to one of the best ones I ever met, Ray Hill. And yet I realized that I was doing nothing as long as I wasn't able to build coalitions and get people to disregard the secondary differences of our color, our sexual identity, all those things that fall or become to me less important than our shared humanity. And that's what people fail to see, I believe, is that there are 7.6 billion human beings in the world, but there is only one humanity, just one, and that's all of us. Until we can learn to fight together, nothing can happen. So that's what I'm sad about, but I'm going to tell you for a minute what I'm happy about. And it's this. If the world needs to change, it won't necessarily change. If the world has to change, it will. And I believe at some point it will have to change because it will be breaking down. You think this COVID is something? I believe this is just a taste of how bad life can become. But when it has to change, it will. And I have faith that in time, the world has already changed. And we're just going through our mental conception, our human conception of time, traveling to that point to where we get to the place where the world is a fair, just, and equitable place for all human beings. Nietzsche said it would take 1,000 years. I don't know. I never lived 1,000 years that I can remember. But I suspect he might be right. Eventually, the world will come to embrace all its inhabitants in a fair, just and equitable way. I tell people, I tell you that, not to make you think, be complacent and think, oh, well, it's coming, so I just might as well just sit back and enjoy the ride. Well, no, you shouldn't sit back. And I don't know that it's an enjoyable ride. People are suffering, and the suffering is, this COVID's been a force multiplier. You've got 42 million people facing eviction today. You've got over 10, probably close to 11 million people without work. And the government's getting ready to cut off a lot of the money. It's going to get worse before it gets better. But what I believe is that it will get better, and the world will be a good place to live at some point. But you and I, going on, we can speed it up. We can bring it along by getting involved, by going out there, by approaching people in a compassionate, understanding, loving way. The world won't change until we learn to look at our enemies as fully invested human beings who are perhaps mentally ill. Because that's what I believe. There's a lot of mental illness in the world. I put it this way. If you met a man with $1 billion, most of us in this culture, we would think, he's a smart guy. He's figured something out. Mental illness wouldn't enter our mind. But if we met a man with 1 billion pairs of shoes, we'd get it right away. That's a sick puppy. There's something wrong with him. It's no different with the money. And until we get it, nothing can change. And a part of that problem is a lot of us, even us activists, we want to be him. We want to have the money. A lot of people in the last several years have gone into social justice and gotten degrees. I'm not sure what they are. Have gotten degrees in college to qualify them to head up 501c3s. Well, the problem with that is that the focus begins to fall off the cause and onto the competition with other 501c3s to get the money, the grant money. The system wins this way too. As long as they keep us competing with each other, we could forget the fight. We forget the fight for justice and get involved in the fight for grant money, for donations. And the system wins. There's a group called, you may have heard of it, Black Lives Matter. They were given $100 million grant from the Ford Foundation. 100 million. Which is all fine and good. But up until that point, Black Lives Matter was primarily a slogan that was used and bandied about by three black women, who are, by the way, now all millionaires. So they've been bought off. I'm not saying that they're not throwing a lot of that money around, sending their people to training and this and that, and putting money behind this and that. But they've become, to my way of thinking, unwitting reactionaries to the system. The system has rewarded them to the tune of hundreds of millions, well, 100 million, Ford alone. And there are other people that have given them lots of money. And of course they have to pay themselves a wage commensurate with their position. So they have a lot of money. They don't think like the people they're representing, who are wondering how they're going to get by this week when all they have in the refrigerator is a dried out half orange and a bottle of water. We're in a bad way. And the problem isn't them. It isn't the system. it's us. Till we can change our thinking and look within ourselves and change ourselves, nothing can change. I ask people this when I speak to them. I say, what if the only thing keeping the world from changing to a more equitable, fair, and just place was you changing? Would you? And I'm asking you that. Will you change? Will you educate yourself and open your mind to what is really going on around you and try to see your part as an unwilling participant in keeping the system strong? Will you find the power, because it takes power, to forgive your enemies and to see them as the sick and mentally ill people that they are, and to treat them with compassion and empathy? Because until we do that, nothing can and nothing will change. It's been my pleasure to know so many of you. And now that I'm gone, I hope I'm able to be in a place where I can look over you and watch you. And I hope I see the change and the promise that's coming for a better world. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael.